We have special guests with us right now. Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, activist, best-selling author of 12 books, including his latest, The Greatest Evil is War. He previously hosted the Emmy-nominated show On Contact for RT America and RT International. His work can now be found at his Substack at chrishedges.substack.com. Welcome, Chris. Thanks for coming back to the show.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thanks for having me.
So you wrote this recently, America's Theater of the Absurd, subtitled The 15 Rounds of Voting It Took to Install Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House is part of the carnival of folly that passes for politics. And I just want to go through a little bit of it. Like right here, it opens by saying, our political class does not govern, it entertains. It plays its assigned role in our fictitious democracy, howling with outrage to constituents and selling them out. The Squad and the Progressive Caucus have no more intention of fighting for universal health care, workers' rights, or defying the war machine than the Freedom Caucus fights for freedom. Chris, why is that?
Because they don't have any power. They're just window dressing. We've undergone a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. All of the levers of power have been seized by corporate forces and their lobbyists. The courts have been deformed to serve their interests. The media is largely, almost completely controlled by roughly a half dozen corporations, certainly the airwaves. And it's burlesque. It's vaudeville. It's entertainment. It doesn't. The actual centers of power, which are real, are completely hidden.
So what do you say, what we just saw last week, that actually the Squad does have power because the right-wingers, led by Matt Gaetz in the House, use their leverage to extract concessions for their vote for Speaker. Now, we tried to get the Squad to do the exact same thing, or the progressives, in the House 2 years ago, and we wanted them to extract something for their vote. So they actually have power and leverage, and they could have done something similar, but they didn't. Now, why do you think that is?
Well, they didn't do it because they don't actually have power. For them to defy Pelosi and the Democratic Party leadership is political suicide, and they know it, so they won't do it. It's why they fund the war in Ukraine. It's why they didn't stand up for railroad or freight railroad workers, and they were forced to accept this contract that over 50% of the unionized workers had already rejected, and then they'll do kind of public relations gimmicks like propose, as they did in the House, that they get 7 days of sick pay when they know it won't pass. But to actually confront the centers of power would mean that they would be erased. They'd be destroyed the way the Democratic Party destroyed Dennis Kucinich. Well, finally, they got rid of Dennis Kucinich by redistricting or gerrymandering his district. And then when he ran, I guess it was last year, for the mayor of Cleveland, they pumped in tons of dark money, especially in the last 3 weeks, to destroy his candidacy. So that message isn't lost on AOC or anyone else. So you're right that they could have stood up, and I think you were one of the leaders of this. They had the ability to block Pelosi from the speakership, to demand concessions, but they certainly have read the power dynamics correctly. They wouldn't exist within the Democratic Party, and they lose their seats.
So you mean that Nancy Pelosi and the corporatists would then funnel money into primaries against them to get them knocked out of their congressional seat? That's what they're afraid of?
Yeah, well, that's the power of Pelosi and Schumer and McCarthy, is that they are the spigot. The money that comes into the party comes through them, and then it's given to anointed candidates. So number one, they wouldn't get money from the Democratic Party. And number two, candidates would be funded to bring them down. And they've been completely domesticated by this center of power, which is largely Wall Street. I mean, Wall Street, the fossil fuel industry, the arms industry, all these corporate executives, they fund both parties. So on the one hand, you get the political clowns that speak in vulgar and crude idiom to enrage largely enraged white working class. And then you get the kind of dulcet tones of the Democratic Party to mollify the liberal class. But the centers of funding and the centers of power are the same.
So why, I have a theory on this. So what you're basically, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but would you agree with the statement that the reason why Matt Gaetz and the far right wing of the Republican Party was able to pull this off was because they were allowed to pull this off, as opposed to the progressives in the squad? If they try to do the same thing, they wouldn't be because I'm having a hard time reconciling what you're saying with what I just saw last week.
Well, because the funding sources for the Freedom Caucus will remain, are quite lavish, whereas those self-identified progressives are largely dependent on funding from more traditional sources, and in particular the Democratic Party. So those who are backing these kind of retrograde capitalist forces that fund people within the Freedom Caucus are not going to cut off money for standing up to McCarthy, whereas the figures like AOC and others are quite vulnerable.
So you talk a lot, this is a great article that you wrote, and you talk a lot about how legislation actually gets done, and you lay it out, and you talk about how the corporations own everything and they own the media, and you just mentioned it again. And so here's something that I found out when I was doing Forced to Vote 2 years ago, was that there is this establishment media protection racket for politicians. And it's funny how they all work together hand in hand. And I found the squad won't go to progressive media anymore. They'll go to MSNBC and CNN, which used to be considered progressives' enemies. But they'll go there for interviews all day long, but they won't go to progressive media. And the only one they will go to is The Intercept. And now I figured it out. Well, The Intercept's, CIA operation. It's run by a billionaire who's got interests all over the place. And they are then tasked with protecting politicians. Now, Ryan Grimm did that with AOC and the squad during Forced to Vote. He's continued to do it. He ran cover for them when they squashed the strike for the railroad workers. He ran cover for them, and it left Kshama Sawant, who's the socialist city council member in Seattle, to call him a snake oil salesman. And there's those people there that their all job is to obscure reality. And so I want to show you what happened again. So here's Ro Khanna going on an Intercept show, Ryan Grimm show, and watch, they do it again. Let's just watch.
If Democrats take the House back in 2 years, which seems plausible, it'll probably be by a narrow margin. Is there any thinking going on in the Progressive Caucus now to say, what are we going to demand when that comes around?
First of all, I think it's funny he laughs. Ro Khanna laughed when the journalist asks him, what are you going to demand in 2 years when you win the House back? He just laughs because he knows they're not going to demand anything. And he also knows he's not going to ask a follow-up question. But let's just watch his answer.
Well, Hakeem Jeffries was warned by Kevin McCarthy, right? He said, I had a unanimous vote 2 years ago. Look, I think there are arguments for it. For example, Medicare for All, to get hearings on that, to get a vote on that.
There are arguments for Medicare for All. That's our leading.
They exist. I'm not going to make them.
I'm not going to make them. And I certainly won't make them strongly. And I certainly won't stick my chin up. But they exist and they could be made. Here we go.
But here's the difference. And I believe the fundamental difference with the Freedom Caucus and the Progressive Caucus. The Freedom Caucus, by their own definition, just wants to blow things up and cut things. I mean, that's why they're in Congress. And I disagree with it. I'm not questioning their motives. They're in Congress because they want to reduce spending, cut government. That's an easier thing to be a no on than saying, okay, we want Medicare for all, which is we have to have legislation, draft it, and just say it's a harder thing to do when you have an affirmative agenda.
Somebody should tell Ro Khanna that Nancy Pelosi's been sitting on a Medicare for all bill for about 5 years. So anyway, that legislation's been dressed. So you talk about this in your article.
Write it.
We gotta write it. We gotta.
It takes forever.
It takes forever.
Then you gotta read it.
Oh, then you gotta read it. So that you talk about that, like how they work in coordination, how the corporation owns both those people, and That's kind of how it works with. I'm learning this now. I mean, I've been a comedian for 30 years. I've been in this space for about 5 or 6 years. It is remarkable to see how this works. It was remarkable to see how the corporation protected the Democratic Party when they crushed a railroad workers' strike. Go ahead, speak to it if you'd like.
Yeah, there's complete collusion between. Let's remember who owns MSNBC. These figures, and The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald, I think, has given a pretty prescient critique of what happened to The Intercept. I know a lot of the people, of course, who run it and work there. And Glenn points out, I think correctly, that they all want to, of course, they're pulling down these ridiculously large salaries, but they all want to be invited to dinner with the editors of the New Yorker and the New York Times. And I think that's exactly right. They want to be feted by the establishment. Well, if you are feted by the establishment, you have to play by the rules of the establishment. And that's precisely what organizations like The Intercept are doing, which is, of course, a complete reversal of the goals that Glenn and others set when they founded the organization. So yeah, it's that. I mean, that's nothing new. That's really, that's why we'll call it the establishment of the legacy media exists. I mean, I worked at the New York Times for 15 years. I watched them destroy all sorts of people on, radicals or people that were outside the mainstream or people that questioned the dominant narrative. Just list after list with Ray Bonner, Sidney Schanberg. I worked with Ray in Central America. I knew Sidney Schanberg as soon as he started defying writing about the developers who were eviscerating the middle class and the working class in Manhattan and destroying rent control and everything else. He was out. He ended up working, of course, for the Village Voice and then later Newsday. So, this is a very long history. Gary Webb was destroyed, you forget, by the Post, New York Post, and the Washington Post and the New York Times, who sent reporters down to the Pentagon to sort of get their version of what actually happened in Nicaragua, and then used it to discredit Webb, who ended up committing suicide. So there's a long, long history and that's why these quote unquote liberal news organizations are allowed to exist. They posit themselves as kind of the moral arbiters of society. Chomsky writes about this quite well with Herman and Manufacturing Consent. But the moment you cross and begin to examine or question the motives behind the power elite, then you're immediately pushed out. It's an old story.
Yes.
But of course, it's worse in some ways now because these news organizations are far more anemic in that they're not pulling the advertising revenue that they used to pull, and so they become even more obsequious to the centers of power.
Oh,
this kind of sounds how you just said the Democrats get funded.
Yes.
They got to suck up to. They get the same way kind of funding as from the DNC.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you go on to say these political hacks are, which people were talking about the Squad and these political hacks are modern versions of Sinclair Lewis's slick con artist Elmer Gantry, cynically betraying a gullible public to amass personal power and wealth. I saw it happen right in front of my eyes. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. This moral vacuity provides the spectacle, as H.G. Wells wrote, of a great material civilization halted, paralyzed. It happened in ancient Rome. It happened in Weimar Germany. It's happening here. Can you explain what that means? A dumb guy like me has no idea what that means.
Well, it means the centers of all the institutions and all the mechanisms by which the citizenry might have had at least some kind of a voice, a partial voice, are seized and redirected to the consolidation of wealth and power of a tiny cabal, in our case, an oligarchic corporate elite. And when government seizes up, when it becomes paralyzed and is no longer able to respond even in the most minimal way to the suffering of the wider public, then you create these political monstrosities like Trump or DeSantis or Pompeo or the Freedom Caucus and all the others. that I saw that in Yugoslavia. That's what happened in Weimar Germany with the rise of fascism. That's what happened in ancient Rome. And we also have to acknowledge that part of the disease of late empire is unchecked, unregulated, uncontrolled militarism. And you go back to the quote unquote liberals, the progressive caucus. They have approved $100 billion to the Ukraine. We've given more money to Ukraine than the annual budget of the State Department. And meanwhile, we have a homeless epidemic within the country. Our infrastructure is disintegrating. Families are struggling under the onslaught of inflation. Half the country is living in poverty or near poverty, but you don't respond to, and that's those distortions which happen in Weimar, happen at the end of ancient Rome, and everything else have very frightening political consequences. So that, as I've long said, and I think you agree, Trump, it wasn't the problem. Trump was the symptom. Trump was what was caused by a decayed and corrupt and dysfunctional political system, and it's only getting worse. I mean, the rhetoric is different. And Biden doesn't he call himself a pro-labor
yes.
president?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the rhetoric is different, but the actions are the same. I mean, the freight railroad unions were one of the few unions that retain the right of collective bargaining. Remember, when Biden ran for president, he promised, along with the Democrats, to strengthen collective bargaining power and all that. And of course, he destroyed it. He shoved this, substandard contract, which most people had already rejected within the union, down their throats by judicial fiat, legislative fiat.
So you go on to say H.G. Wells called the old guard the good liberals, the ones who speak in measured. Before I read it, let me just ask you this question. So when you say they sent so I saw it happen. I think I quote you. I think you said that they lie and cheat and steal, and they do it right out in the open. And that's what they're doing now. And they pay fealty to democracy. They know all the words to it. And then they send $100 billion to the most corrupt country in Ukraine, right in your face at the snap of a finger, while they can't send $100 billion to San Diego, San Francisco, Houston, Dallas, Miami, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, Minneapolis, so we can fix our homeless people living in everywhere. They do it right in your face now. And so my question is, what do they get out of that? Like, if you're going to send $100 billion, which you're just inventing anyway, right? That's not real tax revenue. That's just invented money. So why don't they just invent $100 billion and send it to America at the same time? So people, I don't get what they get out of not doing that. Do you?
Well, because they're sustaining Raytheon and Boeing and all of these arms contractors who fund the party.
Right.
And so what they get out of it is they're serving their masters. They're serving those corporations that give them political power. I mean, if you took away this money, they wouldn't have political power. Pelosi, Schumer, who would put these people in power?
Wait, so is that even a pyramid? It's just a circle?
They exist, and they are not about to, all these petitions to get money out of politics, mailing them into your representatives, misses the fact that almost all of these people wouldn't be there without this system, and that is their power, and so they're serving their centers of power, which is why these stocks have gone up, I think, 35%
yes.
or something since the war in Ukraine.
Yes, they're the only stocks that are going up. Every other stock's going down.
Right.
Why don't I trade stocks? We know where the money is.
I know. Why didn't I just buy Wraith? I don't know what I was thinking. So, Bitcoin. God, Jesus. Anyway, so I understand why they do that. Like, I understand why they fund $100 billion to Ukraine, because that's for their donors and that's they're doing. But why not at the same time send $100 billion to America? That's what I've been saying. And the reason I come up with is that the government, the United States, people think that our government is just regular corrupt. They have no idea that it's 100% totally corrupt and completely purchased by corporations. So the gears of the government only work in the direction of corruption. You've got to have money to grease those wheels to get it going. There's got to be corruption. And so it just doesn't work the other way. Like you say, the levers of government have seized up. It just doesn't work to help people. Is that right? Am I right? Close?
Yeah, but it's even worse than that. I mean, because now you have the Fed and the central banking system to curb inflation. What are the two objectives? It's to create more unemployment and reduce wages.
Yes. That's how we're going to get.
They're open about it. They want more unemployment.
Yeah, they say it. Larry Summers was sitting at his in the Bahamas at a.
He looked great, by the way.
Looked great. Had a great tan, and he's talking about how we got to get people out of work.
Yeah.
So
that's why.
So you say H.G. Wells called the old guard the good liberals, the ones who speak in measured words and embrace reason, the inexplicit men. They say the right things and do nothing. That's what we have now in the Democratic Party. They are as vital to the rise of tyranny as are the Christian fascists, a few of whom held the House hostage last week by blocking 14 rounds of voting to prevent Kevin McCarthy from becoming Speaker. By the time McCarthy was elected on the 15th round, he had caved on nearly every demand made by the obstructionists, including permitting any one of the 435 members of the House to force a vote for his removal at any time, thus guaranteeing political paralysis. Now, is that A, true? And B, I guess you think it is, you wrote it, but B, why would he allow that, McCarthy? So correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't this the way it always was and then Nancy Pelosi changed that rule? So correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, that is true. However, it does appear that these figures within the Freedom Caucus intend, just like they got rid of Boehner, remember, they intend to hold McCarthy hostage. I mean, I think there's an intent to hold him hostage to push through their agenda. But, the idea that McCarthy, like Liz Cheney, somehow respects democratic institutions is just wrong. This isn't a battle. It's a battle for power. It's not a battle over ideology. I mean, McCarthy, who was backed by Marjorie Taylor Greene, he's as morally bankrupt as they are. He joined the majority in this Texas lawsuit to try and void the 2020 election results in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, in Georgia. He advocates there's no McCarthy. It's all about power. I mean, he's an empty suit.
He's the male Nancy Pelosi. It's all about power and money, and
yeah, and so tax cuts for the wealthy, further deregulation of corporations, war on immigrants. There's really very little daylight between him and the Freedom Caucus,
right? Or him and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer.
Yeah, there's very little. The difference is rhetorical.
Yes,
but yeah. In terms of policy, no.
No, in terms of policy, no. As we learned with Donald Trump, right? When Donald Trump became president, he didn't legislate, he didn't govern any differently than any of the other people. In fact, he deported less Hispanics than Barack Obama, and he started less wars than Barack Obama and Joe Biden. So it was the exact opposite of what Chomsky always says, which he's wrong every 4 years. I just want to let people know. Every 4 years, they're going to roll Chomsky out on a dolly so he could tell you to go vote for the Democrat, even though the Democrat is not the lesser of two evil, as was proven by Bill Clinton and George Bush the first.
Isn't the lesser of two evil, by the way, supposed to be like, I don't want to do this, I got no choice, and not smugly and self-righteously, I chose the lesser.
I chose democracy. The irony of everybody saying that midterm was about democracy, and the first thing they did when they got elected was commit fascism against the railroad workers was hilarious. Okay. So then you talk about this junk politics. You say this political vacuum. So there's been a political vacuum created, right? Because nobody in government actually represents the people. They only represent their corporate interests, which means it's completely controlled and it's not really a democracy, which I've been trying to tell people. You didn't lose your democracy on January 6th. That didn't undermine democracy. Your democracy was stolen from you decades ago. It's adorable that people think that somehow a bunch of yahoos in pajama bottoms and buffalo helmets were going to overthrow the military-industrial complex that is the United States. That is a joke.
We almost lost the whole thing, Jimmy.
So you talk about this. You say the political vacuum that has been spawned, which gave us Donald Trump. has spawned a thing you say anti-politics, or what the writer Benjamin Demat called junk politics, which personalizes and moralizes issues and interests instead of clarifying them. Junk politics maximizes threats from abroad while miniaturizing large, complex problems at home. We're living. So this is what we've been screaming about at this show, is that we have 1,000 military bases. They say only 800, but there's 1,000 military bases around the world draining our treasury the same way every empire ends. And then we have still half the country's poor or low income. 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck. 50% of wage earners earn $30,000 or less. That's a failed state that we live in. People get sick, they go bankrupt. People living under, and they minimize all that. We're living in that, right? So now we have junk politics. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, this is Demat's term, and he wrote a good book on it. It's this ceaseless flood of patriotic, religious, macho, therapeutic positions to essentially uncouple issues from reasoned foundations, to use his words. And it infantilizes the public. It's with this year-round upbeat Christmas tales. But the function is essentially to solidify the status quo and protect the interests of the billionaire class. There is no the forms of control, the social bonds that are used to keep people in check are a massive prison system, the largest in the world. We have about 25% of the world's prison population. We're less than 5% of the world's population. And of course, these rapacious, militarized police forces, especially in post-industrial areas where they function as internal armies of occupation. In fact, Biden was one of the major architects of all of this with the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill. There's no difference, the wholesale surveillance of the public. And when your government watches you 24 hours a day, you can't use the word liberty. That's the relationship of a master and a slave. When you look at the actual the fundamental policies, trade deals, austerity, deindustrialization, stripping away of civil liberties under the Patriot Act, and the two parties are completely in lockstep. They will argue about tangential cultural issues. I'm not minimizing a woman's right to control her body and abortion in any way, but on these fundamental structural issues, which is why corporations fund both parties.
So that's another thing people don't realize. So this speaks exactly to what I've been saying, not only on the show, but in my stand-up act, that I have friends, because I stopped being a Democrat when the Democrats cheated Bernie Sanders, right? And then Bernie Sanders decided he'll never stop rolling over for the machine in the Democratic Party. And as I put it, you got to suck the blue cock. Red cocks are corrupt. Blue cocks are full of liberty. And so that's what he's going to. So I still have friends who say that the Democrats just, if they just would fight a little harder, if they were just a little bit better at their jobs, and I have to remind them, they are performing their job perfectly. If you ever go to a Harlem Globetrotters game, you know that they need the Washington Generals, and that's exactly what the Democrats are there to do, is to pretend that they're actually fighting for you. But they always are going to lose, and the corporation's always going to win. And then what people need to realize is that the same guy who pays the Harlem Globetrotters is the same guy who pays the Washington Generals, just like the same guy who paid Barack Obama is the same guy who paid Mitt Romney, George Bush, the same thing. And now, go ahead. You want to say
something? Didn't the FTX kid point blank in that recording say, I also fund the Republicans, but I have to do it dark money so the press isn't mad?
Did he say that? Yeah.
Yeah, he was funding both parties. He was just giving more. Whoever's the winner, you give a little more to.
A little more. And so you go on to say, and I've said this, that the reason why they didn't like Donald Trump wasn't for the reasons they said. They didn't like Donald Trump because he was lying in Washington, D.C. That's not why they never. Oh my God! Did you hear? There's lying. They didn't like him because he would accidentally tell the truth every once in a while. Like, for instance, when they asked him, why are you keeping the soldiers in Syria? And he said, for the oil. They're like, you can't. He's like, no, it's our oil and we're taking it. They're like, get this guy out of here. You can't give the game away like that. And that's exactly. And plus, he puts an ugly face on the face of empire, as Aaron Matte's pointed out many times. But Joe Biden doesn't. And so you say the billionaire class, for the most part, prefers the mask of Joe Biden as opposed to the mask of Donald Trump, who definitely broke the freight railway unions to prevent. Could you imagine how people will go crazy if Donald Trump, a billionaire asshole like he is, crushed a railroad strike union? They needed a guy like Joe Biden, Pennsylvania Joe, blue collar on the beta. He's the greatest pro-union president in the history of our country. That might be true, but he's still an enemy of the workers, who definitely broke the freight railroad unions to prevent a strike and forced them to accept a contract the majority of union members had rejected. But the billionaire class also knows that the goons and con artists of the far right will not interfere in their disemboweling of the nation. Indeed, they will be more robust in thwarting the attempts of workers to organize for decent wages and working conditions. So that's what people don't realize, is that Joe Biden has got the same agenda as those guys, as these right-wing crazy right-wingers, as we refer to them, because they have the same agenda of the billionaire class. And go take it wherever you'd like. That was really interesting. That's what made me think, like, the reason why Matt Gaetz and they were allowed to do what they're doing, because all the things they got, except for the cut in military spending, I think that the billionaire class is okay with. Whereas if the squad asked for Medicare for all or a $15 minimum wage, they could not cave on that. What do you say, Chris?
Yeah. So, this is the point that about the kind of facade. So you're right about Trump. He was kind of gauche and impulsive and not very bright and would insult NATO allies. And what did he call, when he ran for president, he called Iraq a big fat mistake or something, which of course it was. I mean, this is just... and so they love that veneer that Biden presents. He's completely managed. One doesn't really know how sentient Biden actually is, but he's brought it out and cleaned up, and like Reagan at the end. Yeah. So so it's about the presentation. But these corporate forces, remember after January 6th, all these corporations wouldn't fund election deniers. And, well, they're all back to funding all of these people again. Democracy is not a democratic force. Democracy works quite well, in fact, in undemocratic or authoritarian systems. You saw it. I don't want to, draw too many parallels to Weimar Germany and the Nazis, but it was much the same. And the German industrialists and all the good bourgeois politicians didn't want all the buffoons in the Nazi party. Hitler, who wasn't even German, was Austrian, didn't speak very good German. They didn't want him in power. But once he was in power, they were quite happy, the big industries, Krupps and everybody else, to bankroll him and the Nazi party and to work with him. And that's exactly the same here. So Trump was a kind of embarrassment to the empire, but Trump didn't in any way threaten the empire. And should the political system devolve into a series of Trump-like political leaders, they will work quite happily with them. And in fact, of course, these people are even more aggressive against labor unions than the Democratic Party, in the sense that they're willing to take even more draconian forms to crush them.
So finally, my last slide from your article is: I watched fringe politicians in Yugoslavia, Radovan Karadzic. Is that how you say his name? Slobodan Milosevic.
Radovan Karadzic.
Yeah. Karadzic. Okay, Slobodan Milosevic and Franjo Tudjman. I don't know if that's right. Dismissed by political and educated elites as buffoons. They rode an anti-liberal wave to power in the wake of widespread economic misery. Walmart, Amazon, Apple, Citibank, Raytheon, Exxon, Mobil, Alphabet, and Goldman Sachs will easily adapt because capitalism functions very efficiently without democracy. Well, it has been in my whole lifetime. We haven't had democracy in my whole
why do you
lifetime.
think we're afraid of China?
That's right. That's exactly right. So this is what we've been trying to tell people, and no, people aren't waking up to it. So it's over. I think our country's over. This is your book proved. But what we're trying to say is that Trump was a cartoon version of the real fascist that's on his way. And the same conditions that gave us Donald Trump wasn't racism. That wasn't what gave us Donald Trump. It wasn't racism. What gave us Donald Trump, we had just elected a black guy president 2 times in a row, overwhelmingly. And a lot of those people who voted for him voted for Trump. And it wasn't because of racism, because that's what people want you to think. Is Trump racist? Is there racism in America? Yes. That's not what gave us Trump. What gave us Trump is people desperate economically because a class war has been waged against workers in this country since 1980, and it's been won by the billionaire class. That's why after black people in Milwaukee voted for Barack Obama twice, their lives got worse, and then they wouldn't go out and vote for Hillary Clinton. Not because black people are racist, but because black people got let down by the Democratic Party and the establishment time and time and time again, and the game is over now. They're willing to vote for a cartoon game show host. That's how bad it's gotten. And what you're saying here is we've seen this game before, and it's going to get even worse. You're going to get a real strong man who actually does have dictatorial ideas. Trump didn't have. The guy, if COVID happened, if he was a dictator, he wouldn't have given it all back to the states. Anyway, we're getting off in the weeds. But anyway, so go ahead and if you'd like to just comment on that last slide.
Yeah, that's an important point. So in my book, America, the Farewell Tour, I go out to Anderson, Indiana, which is where GM used to have all its plants. 25,000 unionized workers once worked in those plants with decent wages, up to $50 an hour, benefits, well, courtesy of Bill Clinton and NAFTA. Those plants were literally transported to Monterrey, Mexico. They're now these gigantic vacant lots surrounded by cyclone fencing. Anderson, Indiana went into the tailspin of all post-industrial cities with the opioid crisis and suicides. And I talked to the old UAW leadership in the city, and they said during the primaries, these guys all voted for Sanders, but they were never going to vote for Hillary Clinton. And so the UAW didn't even try and tell them not to vote for Trump. They said, okay, vote for Trump, but then vote for the Democratic slate in the state. It didn't work. And that's just a disconnect. You have to remember, part of the problem is that the commercial or establishment press has rendered all of these people invisible. Or if we see them, they're brief figures of ridicule. And why are they invisible? Well, because advertisers don't want you seeing them. That's not how they make their money. I mean, look at all the special sections in the New York Times where I used to work. It's like, what's the living section about? It's about, the struggles of maintaining the second house in the Hamptons or whatever it is. I mean, it's not your lifestyle. It's not my lifestyle, but it's the lifestyle of people they're catering to. So, yeah, we have seen it before. I saw it in myself in Yugoslavia. It's not, go back and read Aristotle. I mean, he writes about it in Politics. What was that, 5,000 years ago? He said that when there's that kind of imbalance and an aristocracy seizes control, then the only two options are revolution or tyranny. And unfortunately, there's been a quite effective war against the old left that kept this country straight, including the Communist Party that's been erased from American history, but the old labor unions, the old CIO, the Wobblies, the IWW, everybody else, they have just been in a relentless campaign, eviscerated, and voices like mine and I love Noam. I do disagree with him on the election stuff, but he is an important figure. Been very important to me.
Yes.
What happened to Noam? Noam's complete. I mean, you could make a strong argument that he's our most important intellectual. We don't agree on BDS, which I support, and a few other things, but nevertheless, he's an important intellectual. He's better known in France than he is in the United States. So that form of control over information and those forms of control on popular radical movements that kept a rapacious oligarchic capitalist system at least in check somewhat. And remember, the New Deal was courtesy of massive numbers of strikes in the 1930s. And Roosevelt was astute enough to realize that either concessions were made. He writes about this in his private correspondence to his brother. Either we make those concessions or we undo a revolution. They were all haunted by 1917 in Russia, thinking that it would happen here. So, but that counterweight is gone, and that's extremely dangerous. And I fear where we're headed. There's just no rational response to the very serious suffering and misery and frustration and despair that is gripping the country. But even the most tepid campaign promises made by Biden have been jettisoned. $15 an hour. Where's that? Where's child care? I mean, all the stuff that he promised, it just went up in smoke. He may not remember it, but I mean, somebody in the Democratic Party has to remember it.
And so when I'm told to be more polite to politicians, it's because, in my mind, because those people who are saying that don't understand the gravity of the situation that we're in. And they think that, all those people have health care, all those people have comfortable lives, quote unquote, and they don't really see what's coming. They don't understand that we are a failed state and that it demands a revolution.
What's even creepier, dude, is you're not to be polite to politicians. They don't mean like you see them in person and you're yelling at them.
Right.
On your show, just observing their actions is where you're supposed to do that.
That's where I'm supposed to be nice. So I think there's no left in America. In America, the left is not connected to workers. The left is connected to middle-class asswipes who care more about gender pronouns than they do about working-class problems. And I think that's do you think we'll ever have a revolution in this country? Now, Christian Smalls in Staten Island organized. So that's the thing. We got to organize along class lines. When people say that, they don't realize what they're saying. They're saying you have to organize with Trumpers, right? With people who voted for Trump, which is what Christian Smalls did at Amazon in Staten Island. Do you think why don't we see more of that? Do you think we will? And do you think there'll ever be a real revolution? Because if there is, I would love to be in part of it.
Right. I think it will only come through that kind of organizing. You're dead right. Ralph Nader's been saying this for a long time. We have to organize around common economic interests. Large corporations, Walmart, what's Amazon, I think, is the largest employer. Walmart's the second. Those two organizations have to be unionized. But of course, as soon as you create a union, as Smalls did, Amazon has lots of way, which they're doing now, to essentially chip away at that union's power, getting rid of people within the Amazon plant who, thinking up a reason to get rid of them. The war against any kind of unionized activity, because strikes are the one weapon that the working class has, the only weapon.
Yes.
Which is why Biden and his administration stepped in to prevent a rail strike, because they know, you go back to the last rail strikes, 1922 and others, you can really shut down the country. You can do serious economic damage. And that's the only mechanism we have to fight back. It's not in the political arena. It's not through the Democratic Party. But we're almost starting from scratch. About 10% or something of the American workforce is unionized. A lot of those are public employees who the right to strike can be taken from them. We're almost having to start from ground zero. And if you look at the economic crisis of the 1930s, thank God we had strong, radical, popular labor movements, because those were the movements that prevented fascism. Remember that they loved Mussolini and Hitler, Ford, and all these figures. And they got Smedley Butler, the former Marine Corps general. They flirted with him to try and actually carry out a coup d'etat. So those popular forces that represent the militant forces that defend the interests of the working class, once they're gone, there's no bulwark left against tyranny. And so we're scrambling. And then we've got all these Taft-Hartley Act, 1947, and all these anti-union laws, right-to-work laws, everything else. The oligarchs have been quite methodical in destroying the capacity of workers to organize and protect themselves. And that's why they're pushing unemployment. And they don't even hide it. I mean, and there's no kind of moral calculus. Nobody's sitting around asking, well, if we're pushing unemployment, what happens to these people? What happens to their families? What happens to their children? Well, that's just the price of bringing down inflation, and the Republicans and the Democrats are both completely on board with it.
Everybody, we're doing live stand-up comedy in Los Angeles in January and February in Los Angeles. And then we're going to Tempe, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Nashville. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets and become a premium member while you're there.